guys, it's Kevintendo, and welcome back to some more gameplay on my channel. Click like and subscribe if you're new, and without further ado, let's get going. The last survey. Now, this is a sponsored video, and you guys are going to see this is a super unique game. The art style is crazy. Red Deer Games, this is sponsored, like I said. Click the link in the description to check out this awesome game, and consider buying it. You might really like what you see. This is a super crazy game about the future of our planet. If you see this icon, your patience is running low. Try slowing down. All right, we're gonna definitely slow down. Something that we all need to do in time to time. For the past year, I've been collecting data, and now my survey's done. I've been to Sudbury in the north, Nomea in the Pacific, Celebo in the jungle, and the desolate desert surrounding Mount Keith. I've seen the raw ore ripped from the earth, open pits ablaze, worked against surface extractors, chugging diesel, and the burning glow of molten opportunity. So if you don't understand what's going on, maybe you will soon, but clearly, this is sad, what we've been doing to the earth. The deafening sound of the world eating itself rings loud in my ears, but now I'm back, returning from my research to share what I've heard. I arrived at the last stop of my tour, the corporate headquarters of my employer, awaiting my scheduled meeting with Victor Ferreira. I took the elevator from the sheer glass and white concrete lobby up to the executive offices on the 19th floor. I've only been up here once before, to celebrate a dividend payoff last year on the terrace looking out over Guanabara Bay. It was a lovely view, but a somewhat bittersweet evening. I couldn't help but feel like the festivities were a rehearsal for the end of days. Champagne and caprina were raised and drained in seemingly endless succession. But eventually, the well went dry. A fitting symbol of mining operations across the globe. They were all beaming that night. It's nothing but tight lips these days. Now I'm summoned again to the top floors, not to rejoice. This time it's panic. The office was eerily calm. I suppose these top floor types have perfected the nonchalant alarm necessary to command companies whose stock prices determine the economic succession of entire nations. An executive assistant sat me in a designer recliner in a plush waiting area cordoned off by sheets of clear glass. They asked me if I'd like anything before meeting with Senior Ferreira. So, this is actually the first time I get to make a decision. Very story-driven game. Very eerie. I'm liking it so far. Guys, by the way, I didn't mention it. This comes out tomorrow. Unless you're watching this in the future, in which case it's already out on Nintendo Switch. Once again, click the link in the description. Alright, here we go. I want either a water or cafezino. I'm gonna go water. That made me thirsty, actually. I need to drink some water right now. The driver ruthlessly weaved through traffic between Santa Teresa and Botafogo. Driving in Brazil, as in many other aspects of life here, necessitates agility. My drink arrived in an unexpectedly timely fashion, delivered by a new stranger, someone I assumed to be a subordinate of my initial greeter. This individual was probably the assistant to the executive assistant, or perhaps the junior executive assistant. Either way, they smiled sheepishly and passed me the ceramic cup and saucer with steady hands. They clearly didn't know the news I was about to deliver. I could peer through the maze-like interior to spy on other near-identical waiting areas of other company dignitaries. Though similarly adorned and fashioned, this antechamber was slightly larger. Further down the hallway, there was also a scattering of meeting rooms concealed by drawn blinds. The rooms looked empty at the moment, but they had undoubtedly been buzzing with recent activity. Ooh, I like how the music's picking up a bit. The intensity is rising. Further down the hallway, there was also a scattering of meeting rooms concealed by drawn blinds. The rooms looked empty at the moment, but they had undoubtedly been buzzing with recent activity. The blinds still swayed slightly from the leftover breeze created from suits quickly being buttoned after a swift round of decision-making. I considered how many decisions had been made on this floor, sealing the fate of thousands of workers from Mozambique to New Caledonia. Their faces flashed before me, stark, hard eyes beneath layers of earth and grease. So we either get to pick. The strip miners in Sorowaka wore reflective UV sunglasses, or I remember the rail yard workers in Onkapuma. I'm gonna do the sunglasses. I like sunglasses. Boom. Idling Caterpillar trucks waiting to bring their cargo to the metallurgist further silenced the already hushed murmur of the Silicu canteen. My guide didn't bother translating their muted chatter, but I could see clearly they knew just as I did that their time in Sulawesi was running short. I spoke to many drillers and loaders during my trip. Though not necessary for my research, I felt that the technical data was only telling one side of the story. The other half could be told by the men and women who worked the floors up to 60 hours a week. The hazardous work conditions across the company's global operations are well documented, and the scant attention paid to safety has resulted in some very public disasters. Some of my employer's subordinate officers would take personal offense to my assessments, calling my remarks outright insulting. But the real effrontery is bearing witness to the almost absent expectations workers have for their bosses to uphold national safety regulations. Though I don't fault the pit bosses and foremen, I blame the double-breasted, two-faced lobbyists who solicit lenient inspections through their bribery and coercion, a practice long maintained by global industrialism. Still in all, whoever is responsible, the burden is most visibly carried by the miners themselves, slung over shoulders in repurposed burlap sacks, lashed around waists with burning nylon rope, gripped by blistering hands that will never fully heal. Up here, sitting in this corporate vestibule, amplified the distance between what happens in the ground and what happens behind a desk. The vintage from the 19th floor was cash positive. Liquidity was up, debt down, shareholders appeased, margins stabilized. But analysts maintained their skepticism, which I thought too premature. It's not the first time the company had concealed private research in order to bolster public opinion. Damage control had recently become a mainstay for the PR executives located just a couple floors below. Though I haven't had the pleasure of gracing those offices, to gently introduce myself to their assistants and acquaint myself with their waiting area furniture, I assumed that one of the first calls following our discussion would be down to their senior officials. Another summoning. I'm sure my findings will require their, dare I say, silver tongues. Waiting to be ushered into Senior Ferreira's suite, I didn't find much solace in my preparations. At one point, I was comforted by the thought that my research would make a difference, one way or another. Even if I couldn't personally halt operations, I imagined my survey as a hand on the lever, ready to pull once the word came from upstairs. Now sitting upstairs, I can't muster that same confidence. It's not that I don't believe my argument is convincing. The binders resting in my leather satchel clearly outlined a dire situation. My research was unambiguous and forthright. In the final concluding pages of Section 12, ironically the first pages I expect Senior Ferreira to read, my message is resoundingly clear. You're effed. The rest of the binder was ostensibly padding to soften the blow, a pillow in front of the pistol. I was attempting to savor my complimentary drink, a facile attempt to ice my nerves. So either we're gonna do my twitching knees, bellied, any sense of composure, or even the ample air condition, sweat beaded at my temples. Let's see. I think I'm gonna go with my twitching knees. That happens to me sometimes. But our first encounter was at a geoscience conference hosted by the University of Melbourne, sponsored by BHP. It was atypical for senior executives to attend academic gatherings, but he was on a personal recruitment mission. He approached me after I had delivered a paper on alloy yield generation using current extraction methods. We walked through Carlton Gardens and had dinner staring up at spot-lit Parliament building. After a barrage of questions about my research, he offered me a consultancy with a retainer that made me blush. I tried to be coy and said that I'd have to think it over, but I found myself accepting the position even before he ordered dessert. It seemed as though more than enough time had passed for word of my arrival to reach Victor's inner chamber. I should expect the natural delays that plague operations of this magnitude. I've come to expect Victor's attention being pulled in a million directions at once. It comes with the territory of the 19th floor. You can't be up here if you aren't juggling several meetings simultaneously, writing a small email while talking on speakerphone, reading a report while watching the stock ticker, signaling off on public memos while placating shareholders. Victor, like most executives I've met, was a quarry of cognitive dissonance. You could smell the miasma of doublespeak seeping out his pores. Like most men in power, he could talk at length without really saying anything, hurling countless syllables and sentences at your general direction without taking a position one way or another about any particular topic. The breeze of words that wafted from his mouth could be interpreted as chilly or balmy. It would merely depend on your temperature or temperament. His talk was engineered to be that way, manufactured out of a careful verbal lexicon of convincing neutrality. For Victor, language was a mirror, a shield of glass that could tilt this way and that to represent the best vantage of yourself back to you. And let it be noted, not represent, but represent. To represent the best vantage of yourself back to you. But somehow, every time I hear him speak, I find myself forming an opinion. I'd instinctively react, formulating responses and criticisms, assuming I was in the midst of a conversation. It's only much later, only after trying to digest his shards of discourse, that you realize, as I do time and time again, you were mostly talking to yourself. In truth, he was more magician than executive. The door to the waiting room squealed on its hinge. The original assistant who greeted me at the elevator asked me to follow her to Senior Ferriera's office. She didn't wait for my confirming reply and started down the hallway before I had fully gathered my binder-filled briefcase. The swish of my linen pants and the clatter of the assistant's heels reverberated in the vacuum of the hallway. I was led to a massive set of double doors flanked by identical receptionist desks. My guide stood to the side and gestured for me to advance through the midnight-stained teak doors. My hour had come. I cleared my throat, and I walked in. But I was stymied by a brusque command to halt any further entry. I scanned the room in search of the owner of my hostile welcome, but Victor was not to be found. I realized the shout came from behind a cracked door that must have led to an even more private room, the executive bathroom. I heard a sharp turn of a faucet handle and a water splash into a hidden basin. Almost immediately, the running water ceased and Victor's office became a cavern of stillness. He threw open the door with a scowl and without speaking, gestured for me to take a seat. Attempting to regain some composure, I shuffled into the room and took the most immediate seat I could find. Victor stood. He loomed there like the Stracomulus formations I saw in the Malacca Strait, a high pillar ready to rain down on me. His face was a picture of stress, deeply lined with worries, undercolored from poor eating habits, ruddy from overactive socializing. Yet he held himself in a way that was more than mere confidence. His countenance was a challenge, an invitation to best wits, a barrier of power. He was an offspring of Prometheus, a bringer of fire, the trickster/sculptor who forged civilization as an act of defiance. But his physical person belied these projections, for his stature wasn't what you would call imposing. Victor was the model of executive physique, bland, He wasn't tall or short, wide or trim, barrel-chested or sunken. He was a man in between, perhaps at one point more chiseled, but not fully in a state of decline. A passing glance would say that he was handsome, but it was more inoffensive than picturesque. But that was Victor, an anonymous silhouette encased in an unmistakable presence. My bag rested on my lap like a corpse. I folded my hands over the damning contents inside, as if preparing for the final sermon of my research before sending it to the great beyond. This is how I imagined I must have looked, because I took a deep breath to launch into a speech when Victor interjected, "Keep it short." I exhaled at the interruption, protruding my mouth in exacerbation. Frowning at the thought of merely following his crude directive, I plucked the binders from my bag and held one out for Victor to examine. He hesitated, but eventually slid across the carpeted floor to meet me where I sat. In one motion, he reached into his jacket to retrieve his reading glasses and started immediately leafing past my introductory statements. He cursorily glimpsed past my citations and footnotes, pausing occasionally on graphs with downward trajectories. We didn't speak while he paged through my analysis. Victor became absorbed in the research. With my packet in hand, he stood in order to pace about the room. Couldn't tell if it was a good or a bad sign. However, I noticed his meanderings weren't as orderly as I had expected. He didn't merely strut back and forth or walk in a circle. Instead, he zigzagged about his domain, etching secret runes into the imported tapestry that covered most of the floor. Watching him, I realized I hadn't properly acquainted myself with the furnishings of this palatial office. It was impressive, but not outright gaudy. A decorator's touch was noticeable, but not heavy-handed. I could see moments where the CEO had intervened to satisfy his own ego. The typical framed pictures with smiling international dignitaries were discreetly relegated to one cabinet near the entrance, but the cabinet of trophies, awards, and various notability accolades that I would expect to see in an office of this magnitude and prestige was absent. Space that would have been dedicated to such things was instead occupied by pictures of his family and posed photo ops, with pit bosses and engineering staff at various facilities signaling to anyone visiting, "My employees are like my family." I didn't think of Victor as a sentimental type, so I assumed that arrangement of photos must have been a strategic decision. I imagined him during negotiations walking visitors over to this area and telling a very compelling tearjerker in order to sway the attitudes of his adversaries. He'd lean in close, almost whispering into the ear of his interlocutor, reciting his story with a tactical tone of empathy and compassion. His victim would be moved, clearing their throat or adjusting their tie, and would tell Victor they'd reconsider their position or withdraw their complaint, whatever it may be. I wondered if he'd try that maneuver on me. More importantly, I questioned whether I would have the willpower to withstand his maneuver. My scrutiny of Victor's interior decoration was further piqued by the lack of televisions, and many offers I had wandered into over the years, the low-volume murmuring of flat screen was a common feature. Besides the pair of split-screen monitors stationed at his desk, Victor's office was remarkably tech-free. Even the lobby had a couple of TVs playing welcome messages with brightly tinted infographics and stock photos of happy workers. It falsely communicated to visitors that they had his undivided attention, but he checked his mobile at an obsessive rate, shifting the weight of my binder intermittently so that he could tap out a quick text. It was to be expected. Someone of his importance couldn't do without feeders. Somewhere in the floors below, I imagined rows of henchmen filtering the day's news in order to cater to their leader's limited attention. He had that kind of power, the ability to shape his daily intake of information. He was nearing the end of Section 8, my analysis of solvent extraction and alloy leaching, when he peered over the rim of his glasses to meet my gaze. He soured, puckering his face in preparation for a bitter assessment of my work. This doesn't look good. I nodded solemnly, interlocking my fingers over the unopened copy of the dossier on my lap. No, Victor, it doesn't. He huffed in consternation, folded his glasses with one hand, and stood in the middle of the room. He surveyed his domain, assessing the impending fall of a kingdom under his reign. Eyes darting back and forth, Victor calculated the various possible outcomes of what he had just read. He shuddered slightly, squeezing his lips into a tight, thin line as if having just drank a double shot of shakaka. Kachaka. Placing his glasses back upon the bridge of his nose, he returned to my document where he had left off. Taking long, emphasized strides, he moved to behind his desk, pulled out his chair, and slowly eased into its padded seat. The chair rocked to a rhythmic squeal that Victor didn't seem to notice. I couldn't read his silence, so I pensively remained still. I inhaled deeply, releasing a slow sigh. Our meeting thus far hadn't exactly met my expectations. The sudden emotional attachment I was feeling for my emotionless presentation of data gave me a dizzying sensation, as if the minor sway of the 19th floor and the Brazilian breeze was making me nauseous. Gravity was playing tricks on me. The heaviness of this room, the density of my dismay, the weight of my research. It bore down on me, a faceless hammer pounding against my heart. Victor gave no sign of capitulating to my concerns. I was beginning to wonder if he would even notice if I'd just gotten up and left. For all I knew, he was probably expecting it. Victor breezed through the next several sections, realizing, as I had initially estimated, that what he really cared about was the conclusion. I turned to the sound of papers flapping against themselves as he flipped to the end of my briefing. He reared his body up from the fortress he called a desk, and again made the face of tasting something gone off. He clicked his tongue once or twice, as if to prepare the room for more violent noises that were about to emanate from his face and disturb our muted surroundings. But instead, he cleared his throat and said, "So, we're in deep crap." I half gasped at his summation, partially out of relief, partially out of unexpected brevity. I ventured a response. That's one way of putting it. I explained how my survey created a comprehensive analysis of the company's current operations and argued the scientific imperative for preventing further repercussions. Choosing my language carefully, laden with just enough jargon, I mastered a professorial tone in order to reinforce the salient message of my verdict. Opening my own copy of my research, I paged quickly to a specific graphic to emphasize my talking points. I could sense my explanation was not exactly satisfactory to Victor. It was as if every word I spoke further creased his taut poker face. I could see him clenching and unclenching his jaw, the muscles bulging at his temples in a tight rhythm that matched his wispy nasal breathing. But my eyes searched his expression for any sign of receptiveness, but as I've come to expect from Victor's acidic stare, I got very little indication that my impurities were met with any kind of sympathy. The veins stretched over his tensing upper jaw pulsed with a quiet energy. It was clear that all my statements were being measured against his bottom line, a series of calculations that even I couldn't predict. I continued to offer my professional opinions despite Victor's obvious growing impatience, and felt that the veracity of my claims were slipping through my own grasp. I could tell I was starting to spiral, not quite in freefall, but assuredly pinwheeling into obscurity. Emphasizing oblique data points was not going to assist my case. Victor had already read between the lines. He already saw the hidden messages nestled between bar graphs and histograms. He hadn't come this far without being able to detect the subtlety of data. I hesitated a moment to catch my breath. I tried to disguise an inward sigh that came with my exaggerated inhale. An arched eyebrow flashed across Victor's face, and he placed the binder onto the absurdly low coffee table that rested in front of me. I noticed Victor already earmarked some of the pages so that his henchmen could dissect my research at a later date. Or maybe they were dog-eared for his PR goons to appropriate for positive spin. It could be that Victor saw something in those pages that I didn't, or noticed discrepancies that I had somehow overlooked. My speculation was veering into self-doubt, a sign that no matter what my approach had been up to that point, Victor had put me on the defensive. I had to readjust. Victor crossed his arms, possibly sensing I was about to change tactic. So which one will we say? Pretty inconsequential to you? Ooh, they're both kind of aggressive, but... Oh, I'm gonna go with this one. None of what I said is actually news to you, is it? Regardless, my strategy, ill-advised as it is, seemed to have some positive effect. He removed his glasses in the same exaggerated motion as before, and rested his chin on his palm in a rehearsed, faux-thinking pose. Rubbing the day-old stubble peppered on his liver-spotted jawline, Victor contemplated adjusting his school master-in-training attitude. He cleared his throat, whipped his hands behind his back, smacking them together as he clasped them in place to maintain his peacocking posture. Some of it is news. He frowned at his own response, realizing that any amount of honesty afforded to me might be a mistake. I could tell he was a man that didn't enjoy being off guard. He was unused to conversing, more accustomed to giving commands. I grinned meekly in acquiescence. The minor tells and the center's reception to my report gave me some idea of his leanings, but I still couldn't tell if the discussion was going to alter the direction of our imminent troubles. I'm sure Victor could sense my unease, but I too could tell that holding a meeting for longer than 15 minutes in his personal office with anyone other than a potential acquisition executive was a rare activity. Possibly it was grating to him that the conversation had gone as long as it did, expecting instead that I merely deliver my news and make a quick exit. A crisp, synthesized chirp interrupted the dampened room. Victor's desk phone was ringing. He lingered in the middle of the room, refusing to even look in the direction of the noise emanating from the russet surface. The sound erupted again, this time sending Victor into an oddly dignified fit of movements in order to descend onto the VoIP headset with a staunch, white-knuckled temper. He melted across the room, glancing back at me. I'll just be a moment. Even if unexpected, Victor wouldn't let any minor interruption halt his opportunity to have the last word with me. Collecting himself, he snatched the handle of the receiver and tersely alerted whoever was on the other end that their sudden presence, albeit remote, was unwelcome at the moment. He pinched his face and severe brow softened momentarily. His eyes twitched back and forth, as if he was reading an invisible memo trapped inside the skull. His initial instinct to berate the caller now seemed uncalled for, and it made me deeply curious as to the content of their conversation. Victor read my obvious eavesdropping and glared at me before sitting down to swivel his back to me. His tone turned to gentle, speaking slow and brief. The caller did most of the talking, and I could make out a heavily compressed sing-song cadence from the earpiece. It sailed into the room at a decibel just barely higher than the HVAC, interspersed with Victor's affirming grunts and tender agreeing phrases. He spoke a combination of Portuguese and English, peppering industry jargon with more personal appraisals. Maybe this was another facet of his executive acumen, a hidden, compassionate tone to balance his otherwise ruthlessness. But I was only assuming that this was the case, since when it came to the actual business side of how the company ran, I had trouble deciphering the economics of it all. Finance was never my strong suit. For me to pretend that I knew how Victor actually behaved as an executive was misleading, since I had hardly ever seen it firsthand. I could only glean his activities via the occasional newspaper clippings or Bloomberg interview. His reputation was well regarded, but that standing was amongst other like-minded global capitalists. I suppose my distrust for Victor wasn't personal. It was grounded in an avid skepticism of people like him, men in power, men making decisions that gravely affect people, communities, and cultures. I could never admire a man like him, mostly because they only admire men like themselves. Victor's phone call was dragging on, but he seemed content to stay on the line. I was starting to grow uncomfortable in my over-designed seat. Staring down at the cover of my binder, the possible futility of further conversation started to dawn on me. I couldn't sit still any longer. So do we quietly start to stretch our legs or pack our belongings? I think I'll start packing my belongings. I started to rearrange my bag to accommodate for my binder to fit snugly between my other belongings. I had probably over-prepared for this meeting, bringing supplemental material from academics and field research not affiliated with the company. Their impartial voices were meant to substantiate my own, buffeting any notion of deliberate sabotage on my part. I anxiously compiled this extra paperwork as a way of convincing Victor I wasn't merely an angry academic attempting to take down the high and mighty. I wanted to actively dissuade any accidental labeling of martyrdom, staving off any notion that taking this gig was solely based on some misplaced idea that science could compel men of global capital from sending us further into oblivion. My anger and guilt from feeling any ounce of this, of pretending that the altruism of my task might remove any stain of my research, fueled the lingering bitterness I had felt ever since faxing back my first signed contract. I began rushing my emotions to escape this cavern of complicity and stood jerkily. Victor abruptly spun around to place his elbows on the desk, following my movements with a rather uncharacteristic blank stare. Still talking into the phone, he spoke in deliberately louder English so that I could clearly hear his side of the conversation. "Yes, I'm with them right now. We're going over the survey. Not good, no. Not good at all. I'll call you back later. Ciao." He steadily placed the receiver back down, clicking it back into place with aggressive emphasis. The combination of casual demeanor and honest assessment convinced me he must have been talking to someone he held in very high esteem. Possibly an intimate confidant, or even a back-channel competitor. The mere fact he didn't immediately dismiss their call was evidence enough to assume the caller was someone even Victor couldn't refuse. Maybe he secretly timed the phone call to give him a strategic break in our dialogue, like a nervous date asking a friend to call them in 5 minutes in order to make an excuse for postponing the remainder of an awkward evening. But that seemed petty at best. The phone call must have been unplanned, regardless of its welcome break from dealing with my discoveries. I crossed myself, standing in the middle of the room, striking a pose as if I deserved an explanation. He remained seated, removing his deeply veined hand from the receiver and resting his arms atop his ergonomically sculpted armrests. Unwilling to endure other stalemaents, I decided to pick up where we left off. Okay, do we either say, "Understand the gravity of my findings," or "The results of my survey have far-reaching implications"? We're gonna go with this one. "I hope you understand the gravity of my findings." My research didn't merely outline the remaining amount of minerals and rare earth metals left on Earth. It put forward recommendations on how to curb the current rate of extraction and how best to proceed. Optimization of current processing and smelting procedures could easily be applied for elongating the inevitable. Additionally, in Section 10, I provided summaries of cutting-edge research and synthetic alternatives to silver ore production, and gave approximate estimates for manufacturing costs with timeline considerations. As a scientist, I felt it my responsibility to avoid providing data alone. I felt offering solutions or suggesting that there are ways the company can continue to thrive without much financial sacrifice might benefit my overall arguments for slowing down. I tried to show him the silver lining. Certainly, this was meant to appeal to Victor and his shareholders, men of deep pockets and narrow imagination. The senator rose from his creaking seat. Digesting my analysis, he nodded to himself several times, silently, solemnly, without projecting any solutions he might be arriving to. He scratched at his temples. My statements weren't exactly revelatory, but I felt it my duty to say them. Victor needed to know that this wasn't just a pet project of his. The information contained in my binder painted a bleak picture, to be sure. Victor understood the complexity of what my research presented, and I didn't want to harangue him into action. Presenting any kind of ultimatum would be a non-starter. I had no power or leverage to do so. Besides, the NDA I signed presented a litigious scenario that I couldn't fiscally or mentally afford. I had seen colleagues destroyed, with unruly sponsors unsatisfied with funded research. Friends and peers alike have been stripped of status at the hands of dark money and shell corporations. Nowadays, whistleblowers, even in countries with so-called stable democracies, have been put in the crosshairs. Some crushed in the courts, others blackmailed into silence, and others still put in physical peril. The price of speaking truth to power had come with a high premium. These thoughts crept through my mind as I waited Victor's response. At any point, he could call in security, confiscate my passport, smash my phone, shred my survey, and altogether deny the existence of my work, or my life for that matter. Did he have that kind of authority? Was he someone that could just erase a person off the face of the planet? He certainly had the power to do this with minerals, extracting their worth and then foregoing any consequences. What could be so different with people? My paranoia was starting to spiral out of control, but I couldn't help but think my typical overly cautious suspicions weren't completely unfounded. I tried to silently fish out my phone when Victor noticed I was getting nervous. Is everything all right? I'm fine. You don't seem fine. His retort was flat, but sinister, a statement cut from a dull blade. He grinned at my discomfort and my inability to hide my feelings. Sensing the upper hand, he felt at liberty to admonish my disloyalty as a paid consultant, using all the staid cliches of dog hands and foolish eating habits. He said he understood why I was behaving the way I was, hitting the full stride with his disappointed father rhetoric. His body language became big, his ego ballooning to fill the room with a confident gas, a poisonous gas that could choke all the rainforests of Brazil. Perhaps that's why there weren't any plants in his office. But he let up, relishing in his momentary victory, round one. This spark of discourse meant that Victor had more to say, and I wasn't ready to throw in the towel just yet. Victor apologized for not being more loquacious, his words, not mine. Emptying his lungs revealed a hidden fragility. I could tell that he wanted to justify his perspectives, providing anecdotes of tough decisions he's made in the past. He spoke about his ascension to the 19th floor from unlikely routes and previous employers. Reminiscing about his days as an insurance executive, he smirked. Much of what he was doing now was similar to the work he had done then, addressing risk, measuring the world's pitfalls against its opportunities, tempering hopes against fears, finding every potential to squeeze profit out of tragedy. He admitted the work troubled him initially. Using abstract formulas in order to determine best-case scenarios was an alienating experience. This modern method stood in stark contrast to the face-to-face business mentorship of a previous generation. In time, he said he realized that these new analytical tools would only become more pervasive. Not because shareholders had found new, supposedly exciting ways to thicken their portfolios, but because it gave men like him platforms to mitigate their guilty conscience. The freedom again, Victor's term, and one I would rarely use in this instance, that these models afforded were too enticing for any individual that had harbored any moral scruples. Now, hard decisions were computational. Machines provided the executive class an out for their inhumanity. This isn't exactly what Victor was saying. I was interpreting the mealy-mouthed verbal gymnastics he posed for justifying whatever decision he came to at the end of our conversation. I let him pratter on, tracing the circumference of his globalist perspective with self-congratulating phrases. This was one of those moments where I could tell I was merely an object in the room to change the timbre of Victor's voice as it bounced around the room, a sonic dampening to remind Victor he wasn't alone. Being a fleshy muffler wasn't meant for me. I interrupted. So, do we say, sounds like nothing has changed, or what are we going to do now? I don't really want to be aggressive, so I'm going to go with, so what are you going to do now? The remainder of his sentence trickled out of his mouth like the last drops of mercury from the burst thermometer. The words splashed softly on the floor, solidifying on the carpet, a deep stain on Victor's pride. Agape, stunned, and boiling, he said, "What makes you think I'd tell you that?" He spat the words, cheeks reddening, nostrils flaring. He clenched his jaw, and I could hear the crowned caps of his teeth grinding against each other, fake enamel turning to fine powder. I stood fast, waiting for another retort, another admonishing, another typical expression of self-appointed superiority. Awaiting his response fueled my own inner rage, the anger that had been seething since taking this job. The anger of excavation, dug up over and over again for every site visit I saw with shoddy conditions and back-breaking labor. That anger sank deep, a plumb line weighted with a heaviness that only the most bitter instruments could measure. That anger so dense, thicker than an alloy, bonded together so strong that no smelter could distill, no sintering could liquefy. I prepared to leave. I couldn't bring myself to continue this conversation any longer. Victor didn't stop me. He didn't bother a feigned attempt at imploring me to stay. My briefcase felt heavier than when I had arrived, pulling at my shoulder, straining the socket, fighting my fingers. I inhaled deeply, raising my chest to align my spine. I mustered a final entreaty. "You can stop this." My plea was met with tepid enthusiasm. Victor didn't need his ego inflated more than it already was, but I wasn't pandering to his desire for a lasting legacy. I was clinging onto the hope that Victor's keen sense of opportunity might outweigh his desire to maintain the status quo. Flickers of imagination sparked behind his stoic stare, and I shrugged to communicate that he could at very least think about it, consider the magazine profiles, the accolades, and the clamoring congratulations from all sides. But this wasn't what motivated Victor. Glory was not his game. "I'll take what you've reported into consideration." Victor couldn't be swayed with righteousness or altruism because he couldn't act on their unpredictable outcomes. There was no model to account for selflessness because it had no bottom line. One could blame his education, or his upbringing, or the elitist culture that bred Victor's attitude. One could cite his mentoring, or the corrupting advice of former superiors, or the underhanded behavior of his peers. But if one wanted to pinpoint when, where, and how Victor became the man who stood before me, the apathetic apparition that he is and will always be, one would be hard-pressed to come up with concrete answers. He buried his hands in his pockets after a long pause, indicating to me that the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. Victor looked in my general direction, but refused to meet my eyes. Eventually, he turned to face the floor to ceiling windows. That looked out at the teeming bay below. I imagined him standing long after my departure, watching the paragliders and tourists basking in the warm sun. From Victor's standpoint, those bodies below were all part of one whole, a constituent of potential clients, a populace of consumers. I wondered if he would consider how his own products would be their undoing. Those bodies would turn to dust under the beating sun, but he would be shielded up here, sheltered by the cool concrete of the 19th floor. I swept up my bag and saw myself out. There were no receptionists waiting for me on the other side of Victor's heavy doors, no greeting party to usher me into oblivion. I wished for someone to come, to muster comfort as I crossed the threshold back into the crumbling reality of an ignorant world. But there was no one there, no shepherd, no guide, no ferryman to help me across the river Styx. I meandered back to the elevator, waiting for it to envelop me to its aluminum and steel cage, bringing me back down to the surface, back to Earth, back down. The lobby floor indicator dinged, jolting me out of my daze. I lingered for a moment before shuffling out into the vacuous lobby. Halting in what felt like the precise middle of this cavernous space, I felt an immense isolation. My bag, now half empty, sagged in my limp fist. Inside held a ruin, the remains of my life, of all those lives that will be devastated by what will come next. My ears rang with the high-pitched squeals that emanated from security clearance kiosks. Employees scanned their badges, tipped their hat to the on-duty officer, stretching meek smiles taut with pretend politeness. I wondered if the pain of putting on those faces was due to some internal conflict. Was making an effort to appear content with aiding what ails the planet more strained than I imagined? Did the passive wave of the officer, the nonchalant nod of understanding, smooth over their guilt? Did they have any such remorse? It was hard to tell at this distance, a span measured in meters and morals, a length whose dimensions I no longer knew how to quantify. I had spent the last year trying to mold my observations into data, turning estimates into certainties. Trying to perform that task now seemed beyond foolish. How does one map human decisions? There is no algorithm to resolve a conflicting self, no equations for solving the human spirit. Maybe therein lies the flaw of thinking I could do anything to change Victor's mind. He and all those men in power who shaped the world with their well-researched yet ill-fated decisions is not a variable in some computation. His manner, his motivation, his presence will always fall outside the scope of my survey. For all of my projections, he will always remain the one factor that will prevent solutions from reaching a place of equality. But it can't be all left up to men like Victor. Time is coming yet. Time when Victor's choices will catch up to him. Time when the choices I and others make will undo all they've done. The last survey. Wow, an essay game by Nicholas O'Brien. So guys, a really cool thing about this game is that depending on your choices, it will do various endings, different kinds of endings. So I'm pretty curious. I don't know how many endings there are, but I'm pretty curious if we can get just one different ending. So I'm wondering if it's going to play through again now. Let's see. We click, yeah, start and credits. So we'll click start. And let's see. So this time, oh, your patience is running low. What does that mean? See, I did remember seeing that. So I'm gonna skip to like the decisions. Your patience would be running low. Okay, see at the top, my patience is running low. Try slowing down. Interesting. Oh. See that? Okay, okay. See that at the top? So my patience is running low. Try slowing down. Interesting. So this time I'm gonna ask for a cafezino. So I didn't sleep well. I'm not in fear of my consequences. My drink arrived. See, and so that's interesting because last time it skipped that line. So interesting. Whoa. You were too impatient. Whoa. Whoa. You clearly don't have the capacity to deliver your news to Victor right now. Very interesting. Very, very interesting. You pack up your briefcase, see yourself to the elevator, and take it back to the lobby. Taking the pedestrian footpath underneath Avenue de Naciones Unidas, you walk to the water's edge and stare out into the bay. Your research will never see the light of day. For the past year... Oh, it started over, right? Okay, I'm gonna try it again, but I'm gonna go even faster this time. Skip, 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 skip. You were too impatient. It did it again. Okay, okay, because you pack up your briefcase, see yourself to the elevator, and you walk out, stare at the bay. It'll never see the light of day. Oh, and then it said restart. Did you see that? It said restart. I gotta do it one more time because I keep clicking restart before being able to see what happens actually. Okay. Wow. So there's actually a mechanic built into the game to keep you from skipping through it too fast. Wow. Interesting. Here it is, watch. Your research will never see the light of day. And the only option is the restart down here. But as soon as I click it, watch, it starts writing something. Watch, 3, 2, 1. You saw that? That's eerie. I wonder what it was supposed to say. Wow. Okay, guys. I'm only gonna skip ahead until I see the signal. Okay, now I'm gonna stop. It was a lovely view, but somewhat bittersweet evening. I couldn't help. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. Oh, I'm gonna stop. They were all beaming that night. It's nothing but tight lips. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. I'm gonna stop. I'm summoned again to the top floors, not to rejoice. I'm gonna keep going. I'm gonna stop. The office was calm. I suppose the top floor types have perfected the nonchalant alarm. Okay. Okay, so yeah, this is the coffee that I asked for. I wanted something stronger, but I've grown distrustful of any office-made espresso, so I got something simple. I didn't sleep well last night. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so clearly, I'm still going a little bit too fast, even though I'm pretty much only clicking it when the papers disappear. So they didn't know the news I was about to deliver. I could peer through the maze-like interiors to spy on the other near-identical waiting areas of other company dignitaries. Through the hall, there was scattering of meeting rooms concealed by draw blinds. The rooms looked abruptly, the blinds still swayed. So guys, I'm just gonna go a little bit longer, like I said about, hitting that 1 hour of gameplay, guys. But, feel free and take your time, even on multiple playthroughs. I would like to know what the different endings are. I don't think I'm going to be able to get to the other endings right now because clicking through fast would be, how I get to the other endings. But You gotta take your time, you gotta reminisce, you gotta see the differences. So I can appreciate that. I can appreciate that. So anyway, let's see. What did I do last time? I think I did the sunglasses, so I'm gonna go for the rail workers. Ooh, creepy. That's creepier, actually. I don't remember that graphic. Ooh. Spoke to many drillers and loaders. Hazardous work conditions. Yeah, it's similar, but I think it was a little bit different. I could be wrong. Okay, in the vestibule, cash positive, liquidity was up. Okay, here we go. Analytics maintained their skepticism. I think I did the premature one last time, so I'm gonna go rightfully. So I'm just doing trying to do the exact opposite, and I'm sure there's like a combination, right? Like if you do certain ones this way, that way. Okay, I remember that one. Halt operations. It's not that I don't believe my argument is convincing. The binders resting in my leather satchel was unambiguous and forthright. The rest of the binder was ostensibly padding to soften the blow. Pillow in front of the pistol. Okay, so this last time, I'm pretty sure I did the twitching knees. And so now I'm gonna do the air condition. Okay. Oh, there we go. See, it's showing the AC. And showing me pills. Ooh, sneaky, sneaky. Okay, I'm a scientist. Not charismatic bunch. Come to expect Victor's attention, being pulled in a million directions. 19th floor. Juggling the meetings. You could smell the miasma of doublespeak seeping out his pores. Like most men in power, he could talk at length without really saying anything. The breeze of words that wafted from his speech, his mouth. Engineered to be that way, manufactured out of careful verbatim lexicon. Man, I really hope I can get to more decisions without ruining my patience or whatever. In truth, he was more a magician than an executive. Door to the waiting room squealed on its hinge. Going through the hallway. Oh my gosh, I don't wanna ruin it. It was led to a massive set of double doors flanked by identical receptionist desks. My guide stood to the side. Okay, here we go. Here's another one. My hour had come. So last time I just cleared my throat and walked in. So I guess this time I'll knock lightly. I refused to merely retreat back into the glass-encased limbo I had just escaped from. I turned my gaze downward, making clear my kowtow. Again, there's so many words that I didn't really know how to pronounce, but I tried my best. I projected my humility into every corner. Ah, so this one, it's trying to show like, hey, I'm being a little too passive. Huh. I shuffled into the room. Interesting. So this part was the same. Prometheus, I remember that, the bringer of fire, which was a thing for humans from the Greek gods or something, right? Or the Titans. Titan. Bag rested on my lap like a corpse. Corpse bride. Corpse husband. This is how I imagine I must have looked. Tell me everything. So yeah, this is where I tell him everything. And I carpeted the floor to meet where I sat. He cursorily glimpsed past my citations and footnotes. Didn't speak. He paged through the analysis. He was walking in a zigzag. Walking all squiggly. Watching him, I realized I hadn't properly acquainted myself with the furnishings of this palatial office. A decorator's touch was noticeable, but not heavy-handed. Typical framed pictures with smiling international dignitaries. Space, oh yeah. People would have been for the family normally, but it was not for the family. They leaning close, whispering into the ear of the interlocutor. Okay. I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit faster at the risk of... Oh, man. Dang it. Well, I tried my best. I just wanted one more little option before the 1 hour mark. But thank you guys so very much for watching. I am impatient, but I did enjoy that essay. It was very, very nice and a very good commentary on the world, right? A very good commentary on the way that you know, society is, the way that, you know, capitalism and greediness. So, you know, guys, make sure you check out this game. Link in the description below. Make sure you click that link, check it out, put it on your favorites so you can at least, you know, get it some other time if you're not going to get it today. But I would love to know how your endings turn out. You know, take a screenshot, tag me on Twitter, put it on the Discord or whatever, or tag these awesome developers. And thank you again so much for sponsoring this video. Thanks for watching. If you got all the way to the end, tell me the thing you love most about oil. Alright guys, thanks so much for watching. I will catch you guys next time. Life's a Switch, so let's play.
I look bags hard-boiled, not over easy. Need a large pitcher of some lemon squeezy, not a gummy worm. I need the whole container with a tear in it. Now pour it over. You got some money, that's where I'm headed. Barbecue A1 chicken shredded. You got a beard? Well, I'm trying to lick it. But if I taste it, then I just might vomit.